In the summer of 1863, along the banks of the Alabama River near Selma, a cotton plantation known as Willow Brook became the stage for one of the most disturbing scandals to ever grip the local white society, a scandal so unsettling that it would be whispered about in parlors and churches for decades, always in hushed tones, always with a mixture of horror and fascination. A woman who had been property was given the name, the dresses, and eventually the place of the woman who had owned her. You are now listening to Shadows of the South, where we unearth the most disturbing and forgotten stories of the slave-holding South. Stories that reveal the profound moral rot at the heart of an institution built on human bondage. Willow Brook stretched across nearly 800 acres of prime cotton land, worked by approximately 230 enslaved men, women, and children. The plantation house itself was a monument to wealth extracted from suffering. White columns, rising 3 stories, wrap-around verandas on 2 levels, and windows that caught the morning light in a way that made the whole structure glow like a temple. Colonel Augustus Pemberton, the master of Willow Brook, was 47 years old in that fateful summer, a West Point graduate who had left military service to manage his father's estate. He was known throughout Dallas County as a man of cultivation. He kept a library of over 300 volumes, subscribed to newspapers from Charleston and New Orleans, and was a deacon at the First Baptist Church of Selma. His psychological composition was that of many men of his class and time, convinced of his own benevolence, certain that the system of slavery was ordained by God and beneficial to those it enslaved, yet increasingly haunted by doubts. He could never articulate those that manifested as a peculiar melancholy that deepened with each passing year. His wife, Catherine Elizabeth Pemberton, was 39 years old, the daughter of a prominent mobile merchant family. She had been educated at finishing school in Charleston, spoke adequate French, and managed the domestic operations of the plantation with the kind of rigid efficiency expected of a woman in her position. She was beloved by the white community for her charitable work, organizing church socials, and her insistence on Bible instruction for the enslaved children. Yet Catherine suffered from what the family physician called nervous ailments, severe headaches, fainting spells, and periods of despondency that sometimes kept her bedridden for weeks. The laudanum prescribed for these episodes became something she relied upon more and more heavily, until by 1862 she was rarely entirely without its influence. She and the colonel had been married for 17 years, but had produced no living children, 3 miscarriages and 2 infants who died before their first birthdays. This absence of heirs weighed on them both like a stone, a constant reminder of failure in a society that measured a woman's worth largely by her fertility and a man's legacy by his progeny. Among the enslaved population at Willow Brook, there was a young woman named Celia, 23 years old, in that summer of 1863, born on the plantation to parents who had been purchased together in 1838. Celia worked in the main house as Catherine's personal maid, a position that placed her in constant proximity to the white family's most intimate moments. She was light-skinned enough that rumors circulated about her parentage, whispers that she might be the colonel's half-sister, born from his father's exploitation of her mother, though no one spoke such things aloud. Celia could read, having been taught secretly by Catherine years earlier in a moment of Christian charity that Catherine would later come to regret. She was quiet, watchful, and possessed of a dignity that made some of the white visitors uncomfortable. She had been married in the slave custom to a field hand named Joseph, though they had no children, and saw each other only on Sundays. The household staff included several other key figures who would become witnesses to what unfolded. There was Mama Ruth, 58 years old, the cook, who had served the Pemberton family for over 30 years and who knew more about their secrets than anyone alive. Her son Isaac, 34, was the head house servant and the colonel's valet, a man of intelligence who had learned to make himself invisible while absorbing everything. Sarah, 19, worked in the kitchen and was newly pregnant with her first child. Young Thomas, just 14, served as a footman, an errand runner, his eyes always wide, with the kind of fear that came from seeing too much too young. Moses, 41, was the driver, who oversaw the field workers, a complicated man who wielded the power given to him by the colonel with a mixture of necessity and shame. And there was Dina, 27, the seamstress, who worked in a small room of the main house, her fingers perpetually stained with dye and her mind filled with songs she meant to keep the darkness at bay. The trigger for everything that followed came on a September evening in 1863, during one of those oppressive Alabama nights when the heat seems to press down from above and rise up from below simultaneously, when even breathing feels like labor. Catherine had suffered another of her spells, and lay in her bedroom, curtains drawn, a damp cloth across her forehead. She called for Celia, as she always did during these episodes, finding some comfort in the younger woman's presence. On this particular night, whether from the laudanum or from some long-suppressed grief finally breaking through, Catherine began to speak in a way she never had before. She spoke about her barrenness, about how she felt she had failed in the only purpose society had given her. She spoke about the loneliness of her marriage, the distance that had grown between her and Augustus. And then, in a moment that would set everything in motion, she took Celia's hand and said something that made the young enslaved woman's blood run cold. "You will take my place. When I am gone, you will have what I could not keep. You will bear what I could not bear. Promise me, you will become Catherine." Pause for a moment and reflect. In a world where women, white and black alike, were property in different but parallel ways, where could such a request have originated except from the deepest despair and the most profound distortion of human relationship that slavery created? Celia tried to withdraw her hand, tried to protest, but Catherine's grip was surprisingly strong. The mistress's eyes, unfocused from the laudanum, held a wild intensity. "I've already spoken to Augustus," Catherine whispered, though whether this was true or the drug speaking, Celia couldn't know. "I've made him promise. You will have my dresses, my jewelry, my name. You will sleep in my bed. You will be the mother I could not be." Catherine's voice dropped even lower. "It's the only way I can defeat death. If you carry my name, I will still exist." The words hung in the air like poison, and Celia understood with a clarity that made her nauseous that she was not being offered freedom or elevation. She was being conscripted into a ghost story, forced to become a living memorial to a white woman's pain. Within 2 weeks, Catherine's health had deteriorated dramatically. The physician, Dr. Mordecai Harrison from Selma, attributed it to consumption of the nerves and predicted she would not last the month. The colonel, who had indeed had some form of conversation with his dying wife, though what exactly was said would never be fully known, began to behave in ways that alarmed the household. He ordered that Celia be moved from the slave quarters into a small room adjacent to Catherine's bedroom. He instructed Dina to alter several of Catherine's dresses to fit Celia's frame. He spent long hours in his study, rating what Isaac glimpsed were legal documents of some kind, though the colonel quickly covered them whenever anyone entered. The other enslaved people watched these developments with a mixture of dread and incomprehension. Mama Ruth, who had witnessed many strange things in her years at Willowbrook, pulled Celia aside one morning and said simply, "Child, whatever's coming, you didn't ask for it, and you can't stop it. Just remember who you are, no matter what name they put on you." Catherine Elizabeth Pemberton died on the 1st of October, 1863, as autumn began its slow transformation of the Alabama landscape. The funeral was well attended by the local planter aristocracy, despite the hardships of the war that was then raging. The Confederate cause was already faltering, though few at the funeral would have admitted it. Union forces controlled much of Tennessee. The Confederacy was strangling under the blockade, and young men were dying in staggering numbers. Yet here, at Willowbrook, the old rituals continued as if the world were not ending. Catherine was laid to rest in the family cemetery, in a plot beneath an ancient oak tree, her headstone carved with the words "Beloved Wife," now at rest with the angels. What happened in the 3 days following the funeral would become the subject of scandal throughout Dallas County and beyond. The colonel ordered that the entire household assemble in the main parlor, not just the house servants, but representatives from every quarter of the plantation. In the presence of Dr. Harrison, the Reverend Samuel Whitfield from the Baptist Church, and Mr. Charles Thornton, his attorney from Selma, Colonel Pemberton made an announcement and left several of the white men present speechless with shock. He declared that in accordance with his late wife's dying wishes and his own determination to honor her memory, Celia would henceforth be known as Catherine. Not Celia called Catherine, but Catherine, as if the enslaved woman's birth name had been erased. She would wear Catherine Pemberton's clothing, occupy Catherine Pemberton's rooms, and sit at Catherine Pemberton's place at table. The colonel was careful, with under the attorney's advice, to make no mention of manumission or any change in Celia's legal status. She remained enslaved, remained property, but property that bore the name and external trappings of the mistress. If you find yourself drawn to these forgotten stories, to these stories that reveal the moral complexity and horror of the American past, I invite you to continue this journey with me here at Shadows of the South, where we refuse to let these narratives remain buried in comfortable silence. The reactions were immediate and polarized. Reverend Whitfield, a portly man of 60, with deeply conservative theological views, quoted scripture about the proper order of society and suggested gently that grief had clouded the colonel's judgment. Harrison, more pragmatic, worried aloud about how this arrangement would be perceived in the community and what it might suggest about the colonel's state of mind. Thornton, the attorney, pointed out that while nothing the colonel proposed was technically illegal, an enslaved person could be called anything the owner wished, dressed in any manner, placed in any room. The social implications were potentially catastrophic. Augustus, he said, using the familiar name of a childhood friend, you will be ruined. Your position in society, your standing in the church, your relationships with every family in this county, all of it will be destroyed. But the colonel, who had been quiet through all these objections, finally spoke in a voice that was calm but utterly inflexible. Catherine wished it, and I will honor her wish. That is the end of the matter. And so it began. Celia, now called Catherine by everyone in the household, though some could barely force the name from their lips, was moved into the mistress's bedroom. The dresses were altered and hung in the wardrobe. The jewelry, which legally remained the colonel's property to dispose of as he wished, was given to her to wear. The colonel ordered that she take her meals in the dining room, though he himself ate in his study, unable or unwilling to sit across from the strange phantom of his dead wife. The enslaved community was traumatized by these developments. For Celia herself, it was a form of torture, stripped of her own identity, forced to inhabit the skin of the woman who had owned her, required to wear the clothes and speak the language and occupy the spaces of white privilege while remaining, legally and actually, enslaved. She could be sold tomorrow, beaten, worked to death, and it would all be entirely lawful. The name Catherine Pemberton protected her from nothing. In a society built on the absolute power of white over black, of master over slave, this bizarre inversion created a kind of cognitive horror that white observers found almost unbearable. The form remained, the clothing, the name, the room, but the substance was revealed as always having been arbitrary, always having been a performance. If a slave could wear the mistress' dress, what did the dress mean? If a slave could sleep in the mistress's bed, what sanctity did the bed possess? These questions threatened to expose the emptiness at the heart of the entire system. News of the situation spread through the county with remarkable speed, carried by visitors to Willowbrook, by slaves who communicated through the invisible network that connected plantations, and by white servants and merchants who traveled between properties. The reactions ranged from horrified condemnation to morbid fascination. Mrs. Abigail Thornton, wife of the colonel's attorney, declared that she would no longer receive the colonel in her home and organize other planter wives to do the same. The Selma newspaper, the Dallas Gazette, ran a carefully worded item about irregular domestic arrangements at a prominent plantation that everyone understood was referring to Willowbrook. Reverend Whitfield preached a sermon about the dangers of elevating the lowly beyond their proper station, never mentioning the colonel by name, but making his target clear to everyone present. Young men in Selma's taverns made crude jokes about what the colonel must really want from his new Catherine, jokes that occasionally led to fistfights when someone defended the colonel's honor. But there were also defenders, or at least those who tried to construct a charitable interpretation. Dr. Harrison, despite his initial objections, began to present the situation as a case of grief-induced temporary insanity, suggesting that with time and patience the colonel would return to reason. Some of the older planter aristocracy, secure enough in their own position to afford contrarianism, argued that a man had absolute authority over his property and could organize his household however he wished. To question this was to question the foundation of their entire social order. And there were a few, very few, who saw in the colonel's actions something like a critique of that social order, though they could never say so openly. These were people who had begun, quietly, to doubt slavery itself, who read their Bibles and wondered how the institution could be reconciled with Christian teaching, who saw in the colonel's bizarre memorial a kind of bitter commentary on the arbitrariness of racial hierarchy. For Celia, the woman now called Catherine, these months were an exercise in psychological survival. She moved through the plantation house like a ghost, wearing silk dresses that rustled when she walked, eating food from china plates that slaves had served, and would wash, sleeping in a bed that had been built by slave carpenters. The other enslaved people didn't know how to relate to her. Some were resentful, seeing her as someone who had accepted a grotesque elevation at the cost of her own dignity and their collective identity. Others were simply frightened, unsure what her new position meant for the stability of their own lives. Mama Ruth remained steadfast in her support, bringing Celia food when she couldn't face the dining room, sitting with her in the evenings, and reminding her in whispers, "You're still Celia. Don't let them take that from you." Joseph, her husband in the slave custom, was sent to work on a distant section of the plantation, ostensibly because labor was needed there, but really because his presence complicated the colonel's strange performance. The colonel himself seemed to be disintegrating slowly, like a structure with a fatal crack in its foundation. He continued to manage the plantation's operations. The cotton had to be harvested, ginned, and sent downriver despite the war's disruptions. But he did so mechanically, without the attention to detail that had once characterized his management. He stopped attending church, which was noted with alarm by Reverend Whitfield. He ceased all social interaction with his peers, refusing invitations and turning away visitors. He spent hours in Catherine's, his dead wife's, cemetery plot, standing beside the headstone and speaking in a low voice that no one could quite hear. Isaac, whose duties brought him into regular contact with the colonel, reported to Mama Ruth that the master seemed to be having conversations with someone who wasn't there, would suddenly laugh or weep or speak sharply, as if responding to another person's words. By December, as 1863 drew to a close and the war continued its savage progress, the situation at Willowbrook had reached a kind of terrible equilibrium. Celia wore Catherine's name and clothes, but existed in a liminal space that was neither slave nor free, neither herself nor the woman she was forced to represent. The colonel maintained his bizarre ritual, occasionally speaking to Celia as if she were actually his wife, then moments later giving her orders in the tone one used with slaves. The other enslaved people adapted as humans always adapt to absurdity, finding ways to continue their lives amid the strangeness. The white community had largely ostracized the colonel, but the war provided a convenient excuse for the reduction in social contact. Everyone was suffering. Everyone was isolated. The old social fabric was tearing apart anyway. Consider how slavery required constant psychological contortion from everyone trapped within its system. The enslaved had to remember their humanity while being legally defined as property. The enslavers had to see themselves as benevolent while practicing absolute tyranny. And when that system began to produce scenarios like Willowbrook, scenarios that exposed its fundamental incoherence, the result was a kind of communal madness that no one quite knew how to name or resolve. The beginning of the end came in March of 1864, when the colonel made an announcement that completed his project and sealed his fate. He called the same witnesses who had been present for the original ceremony, Dr. Harrison, Reverend Whitfield, and Mr. Thornton, and informed them that Celia, whom he now called Catherine, without any apparent awareness of the absurdity, was pregnant with his child. He made this announcement with something approaching joy, the first positive emotion anyone had seen from him in months. The child, he declared, would be born free. He would manumit both mother and child, and would be raised as his heir, bearing the Pemberton name. The three white men present stood in stunned silence. This crossed a line that the previous strangeness had not. To dress as Lizoib in a mistress's clothes was bizarre but not illegal. To name a slave after one's dead wife was disturbing but not explicitly forbidden. But to declare that one would manumit a slave and make her mixed-race child once legal heir, this threatened the entire structure of white supremacy upon which the plantation system depended. Reverend Whitfield found his voice first. Augustus, I must speak to you as your minister and, I hope, as your friend. What you are describing is not just socially unacceptable. It is sinful. It is an abomination in the eyes of God and man. The mixing of races is explicitly condemned in Scripture, and to elevate the product of such a union to be your heir is to spit upon your ancestors and everything they built. Harrison, more clinical, expressed concern about the coroner's mental state and suggested a period of rest, perhaps at a sanitarium in Virginia that specialized in nervous disorders. Mr. Thornton, the attorney, was the most direct. If you do this, Augustus, you will have nothing. Your remaining family will contest any will that makes a Negro your heir. The courts will not uphold such a document. Not in Alabama, not now, not ever. And the community will destroy you. You understand that, don't you? They will destroy you utterly. But the colonel seemed beyond caring about such consequences. He had constructed a narrative in his mind, a story in which he was honoring his beloved wife by giving her the child she could never have, by continuing the Pemberton line through the woman who bore her name. That this woman was enslaved, that she had no choice in any of this, that the child would be conceived through what could only be called rape, given the absolute power imbalance. These realities did not seem to penetrate his consciousness, or perhaps they did, and he had simply decided that his grief and his need mattered more than Celia's humanity. The three white men left Willowbrook that day, knowing they had witnessed something that would explode across the county like a bomb. The explosion came swiftly. Within a week, a group of prominent planters, including several of the colonel's cousins, arrived at Willowbrook with a clear message: Augustus must immediately send Celia away, preferably sell her to someone out of state, and publicly repent of his sins before the church community. If he did these things, he might be able to salvage some remnant of his social position. If he refused, they would ensure his complete ostracization and would support any legal action taken by family members to have him declared insane and stripped of control of his property. The colonel, standing on his veranda as these men delivered their ultimatum, simply shook his head and asked them to leave his land. They departed with expressions of grim satisfaction, knowing they had done their duty and that what came next was entirely the colonel's fault. What came next was uglier than even they might have anticipated. Someone, it was never determined who, organized what they called a Committee of Public Safety, a group of about 20 white men from Selma and surrounding plantations, who rode it to Willowbrook on a warm April evening. Their stated purpose was to restore order and decency to the plantation. They were armed, some of them drunk, and all of them convinced they were performing a righteous duty. They demanded that the colonel produce Celia and hand her over to them. What they intended to do with her was left unspoken but terrifyingly clear. They would remove her from the plantation, probably sell her far away, and ensure that she could never return to trouble the colonel or the community's sense of proper racial order. The colonel, however, had been warned of their coming. Isaac had heard rumors in Selma and had managed to get word to Willowbrook. When the mob arrived, they found the plantation house barricaded, with the colonel and several of his most trusted slaves, armed with hunting rifles, positioned at the windows. The colonel called out that they would defend his property, and in that moment, the twisted logic of slavery worked briefly in Celia's favor. She was his property, and no one, not even a mob of his peers, had the right to take his property from him without legal process. The mob hesitated, confronted with the prospect of actual bloodshed and the knowledge that killing a white man of the colonel's standing, even one who had fallen from grace, would have serious legal consequences. After several hours of tense standoff, during which some of the more sober members of the group began to question the wisdom of their action, the mob dispersed. But everyone knew this was not over. The fact that Celia's only protection came from her status as property, that the colonel's defense of her was really a defense of his right to do as he wished with what he owned, reveals the impossible trap that slavery created. Freedom and bondage were so entangled that sometimes the only safety came from one's own enslavement. How it created a social order so rigid that even the smallest deviation from its rules threatened the entire structure. The story of Celia and the two Catherines also reveals the particular horror of how slavery commodified and controlled black women's bodies and identities. Celia was forced to surrender not just her labor and her body, but her very name, her selfhood. She was required to perform white womanhood while remaining legally and actually enslaved, required to bear a white man's child while having no legal rights to that child, required to inhabit the clothes and the spaces and identity of the woman who had owned her. And yet she survived. She reclaimed her name, raised her daughter, and built a life in freedom. However constrained that freedom was in the post-war South, the silence that surrounds cases like Willow Brook in the official historical record is itself a form of violence, an attempt to sanitize the past and make it more comfortable for those whose ancestors perpetrated these horrors. When we refuse to look directly at stories like this one, when we soften the edges or seek easy morals, we perpetuate the lie that slavery was somehow acceptable or understandable within its time. It was not. It was recognized as evil by many of those who lived through it, including some enslavers who could not escape the knowledge of what they were doing even as they continued to do it. Colonel Pemberton's madness was not an aberration, but a revelation of the madness inherent in the system itself. As you reflect on this story, consider what it reveals about power, identity, and the human capacity for both cruelty and survival. Consider how the past continues to shape the present, how the trauma of slavery ripples forward through generations, how the descendants of people like Celia and Ruth still carry the weight of these stories. And ask yourself what responsibility we have to remember these stories truthfully, to honor the people who suffered through them, and to ensure that we never again construct systems of such total dehumanization. These are not comfortable questions, but comfort is not the purpose of history. Truth is the purpose, and these shadows from the South demand to be seen in full light, no matter how disturbing that light reveals them to be. If these forgotten stories matter to you, if you believe that we must confront the full truth of our past, rather than retreating into comfortable myths, I encourage you to continue exploring these stories with me. The South's shadows are long and dark, but only by examining them can we begin to understand the world they created and the world we still inhabit today.